Picture this. The sun is a hammer. It has been beating down since dawn, and now, in the late afternoon of August 9th, 378 AD, the air itself feels bruised. A man stands in the centre of what will soon become a graveyard, though he doesn't know this yet. His armour, gilded and magnificent, has become an oven. Sweat pools in the creases of his neck, slides down his spine, soaks the linen beneath the bronze. His tongue is thick, his lips are cracked. He hasn't eaten since before the march began. 8 miles through dust that rose like smoke and coated every surface, every face, every desperate breath. Around him, 40,000 men are dying of thirst before the killing even begins. The grass has been burned, deliberately. The Goths set fire to the fields hours ago, and now the smoke mingles with the August heat, creating something that feels less like weather and more like punishment. Soldiers cough, eyes stream. Men who marched with discipline this morning now stand in loose formations, legs trembling, hands shaking on spear shafts slick with sweat. And ahead, less than a mile away, sits a circle of wagons, massive wooden carts chained together, forming a wall. Behind that wall, women, children, livestock, and warriors. How many warriors? The scout said 10,000, maybe 15, a manageable number, a number that justified the march, the thirst, the decision to attack before reinforcements arrived. The man in the gilded armour made that decision. He is 50 years old. He has ruled the Eastern Roman Empire for 14 years. He has fought Persians, suppressed revolts, navigated the treacherous politics of a faith that threatens to tear itself apart over the nature of Christ. He has survived everything the ancient world could throw at a man of power. His name is Valens. In 3 hours, he will be dead. But here's what makes this story a tragedy rather than a defeat. Valens didn't have to be here. His nephew, Gratian, was marching from the west with fresh troops, veteran legions that had just crushed an Alemannic invasion. They were days away, perhaps only hours. A message had arrived that morning. Wait for me. We'll destroy them together. Valens read the message, and then he made the decision that would echo through 15 centuries of military history. He chose not to wait. Historians still debate whether it was jealousy, a fear that his young nephew would claim the glory, or strategic calculation, a belief that the Goths might slip away if given time, or simple exhaustion, the weight of a 2-year crisis that had drained his treasury, his patience, his capacity for caution. What we know is this. The Emperor of Rome looked at a circle of wagons, believed his scouts, trusted his legions, and ordered the advance. The Gothic cavalry wasn't behind those wagons. It was somewhere else entirely, out foraging, miles away, racing back at that very moment. Fritigern, the Gothic leader, knew they were coming. He was stalling. Every minute of negotiation, every false offer of peace was a minute his horsemen were getting closer. Valens didn't know. The Romans formed up. The infantry locked shields. The sun continued its assault, and the wagons just sat there, silent, as if waiting for something. Then the horizon darkened. It wasn't clouds, it wasn't smoke, it was horses. Thousands of them, cresting the hills to the west and east simultaneously, dust billowing behind them like the wake of ships. The thunder of hooves reached the Roman lines before the riders did, a sound that started as a rumble and built into something that shook the ground itself. The Gothic cavalry had returned, and they had caught the finest army in the world with its flanks completely exposed. What happens next would kill an emperor, annihilate 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army, and teach every barbarian tribe on the frontier a lesson that would take a century to fully absorb. The legions could be beaten, not just defeated, destroyed. How does our empire lose its aura of invincibility? Not through weakness, but through one afternoon of heat, thirst, and a single catastrophic miscalculation. This is that afternoon. The catastrophe at Adrianople didn't begin with a battle, it began with a river. 2 years earlier, in the autumn of 376 AD, the Danube, that ancient boundary between Roman civilization and the barbarian darkness beyond, witnessed something unprecedented. On the northern bank, stretching for miles in both directions, stood a nation in exile. Not an army, not raiders, families, tens of thousands of Gothic families, men, women, children, the elderly, the sick. They carried what they could. They had abandoned everything else. They were running from something worse than Rome. The Huns had come. No one in the Roman world truly understood what the Huns were. They seemed to materialize from the eastern steppes like a biblical plague. Horsemen who lived in their saddles, who ate raw meat softened beneath their thighs, who could loose arrows at full gallop with accuracy that defied comprehension. They didn't conquer territory, they consumed it. They annihilated the Alans first, then crashed into the Gothic kingdoms like a wave breaking against sand. The Goths had been a proud people, warriors. They had raided Roman territory for generations, traded with the Empire, sometimes fought for it as mercenaries. They had kings, laws, a culture that stretched back centuries. And in a single season, the Huns reduced them to refugees. So they came to the river. To the border of the Empire they had spent generations fighting, and they begged to be let in. The request reached Emperor Valens in Antioch, where he was preparing for yet another campaign against Persia. The message described desperate people, willing to accept any terms, asking only for land to farm and the protection of Roman walls. In exchange, they would provide soldiers, Gothic warriors who would fight for Rome instead of against it. Valens saw opportunity. The Empire was bleeding men. Decades of civil war, Persian conflicts and frontier defence had stretched the legions thin. Gothic warriors settled on empty land, paying taxes and filling the ranks. It solved multiple problems at once. The Emperor granted permission. The Goths could cross. Historians still debate whether Valens understood the numbers involved. The ancient sources speak of 200,000 people, though modern estimates suggest something closer to 100,000. Either way, it was a migration on a scale Rome had never attempted to manage, and the machinery of empire was not designed for mercy. The crossing itself became a nightmare. Roman officers controlled the boats, the rafts, the few bridges. They decided who crossed and when. They demanded payment. They took bribes. Wealthy Goths crossed first. The poor waited on the northern bank as autumn rains began and the Huns drew closer. Some tried to swim. The Danube swallowed them, whole families disappearing into water so cold it stopped the heart. Those who made it to the southern bank found something worse than the river. The local Roman commanders, Lupicinus and Maximus, saw the refugees as profit. The Goths had been promised food, but supplies were delayed. They had been promised land, but settlement locations were still being determined. Meanwhile, Gothic families starved. Children wailed through the night. The elderly simply stopped waking up, and then the markets opened. Roman soldiers began selling food to the desperate Goths, at prices that would have been criminal in peacetime. A loaf of bread cost what a Gothic warrior might earn in a month. Wine was priced in gold, and when the gold ran out, the Romans accepted other payment. They took dogs first. The Goths ate dog meat while Roman soldiers laughed. Then they took children. The slave markets of the Eastern Empire filled with Gothic boys and girls, sold by their own parents for a few days of food. Families that had survived the Huns, survived the crossing, survived the camps. They were dismembered by Roman greed. Fathers watched sons led away in chains. Mothers handed over daughters and then had to keep living with what they'd done. This was not policy. It was not ordered by Valens, who was far away and focused on Persia. It was the casual cruelty of petty men given power over the desperate. It was the Roman frontier system functioning exactly as it had always functioned, treating barbarians as resources to be exploited. But the Goths were not a conquered people. They were refugees who had asked for help. They had given up their weapons at the crossing, another condition of entry, but they had not given up their pride. And as the winter of 376 turned to the spring of 377, that pride curdled into something else. Rage. The Gothic warriors began to remember that they were warriors. They began to talk among themselves, in camps that Roman soldiers rarely entered, about what had been done to them, about the children, about the dogs, about the promises that had been broken before the ink was dry. And they began, very quietly, to rearm. Roman soldiers were surprisingly willing to sell weapons to people they were simultaneously starving. The price was right. And what harm could a few swords do? The answer would arrive at Adrianople, but first there would be a dinner party. The smell of roasting meat drifted through the Gothic camps, and it was almost worse than the hunger. Almost. The Romans had established their supply depot at Marcianople, a prosperous city in Thrace, and the Goths had been escorted there under the pretense of distribution. For weeks, Gothic families had watched Roman supply wagons roll past their camps, wagons heavy with grain, with salted meat, with wine, heading toward garrisons where soldiers who weren't starving would eat their fill. The refugees received nothing, or worse than nothing, they received promises. Tomorrow, next week. When the situation stabilizes, the situation never stabilized, it rotted. By early 377, the Gothic camps outside Marcianople had become something between a refugee settlement and an open-air prison. Roman soldiers controlled movement, Roman merchants controlled prices, and Roman cruelty had no apparent limit. The dog-meat economy reached its peak that winter. When the Goths ran out of dogs, they ate rats. When the rats grew scarce, they ate leather, boiled until it became something that could be chewed, if not digested. Mothers learned to quiet hungry children by pressing wet cloths to their lips, the closest thing to a meal they could offer, and through it all, the slave trade continued. Historians still debate whether Lupicinus, the regional military commander, personally profited from the trafficking or whether he simply allowed it to happen. What's certain is that it happened under his authority, in his jurisdiction, while he did nothing to stop it. The going rate stabilised at approximately 10 pounds of dog meat for one Gothic child. The children were transported east, toward the markets of Antioch and Constantinople, where wealthy Romans purchased them as household servants, labourers, or worse. One ancient source records a detail so specific it must be true. A Gothic mother, having sold her son for food, used part of that food to nurse her remaining infant. The infant died anyway. The mother did not outlive it by long. This was the empire that called itself civilized. The Goths, meanwhile, were changing. The men who had crossed the Danube as defeated refugees were becoming something else, something hardened by suffering and sharpened by hatred. They had given up their weapons at the border, yes, but weapons could be acquired. Roman soldiers, secure in their superiority, saw no danger in selling swords to starving barbarians. What could they do with them? Where could they go? The answer was nowhere, and everywhere. Fritigern emerged during this period as the leader the Goths needed. Unlike Athanaric, the old king who had refused to cross the Danube and fled instead into the Carpathian Mountains, Fritigern had chosen survival over pride. He had converted to Arian Christianity, the same theological variant that Valens himself followed, as a diplomatic gesture. He had negotiated the crossing, accepted the humiliating conditions, counselled patience. But patience has limits. Fritigern watched his people die. He watched children sold. He watched Roman officers grow fat while Gothic families wasted away. And he understood, with the clarity that only suffering provides, that Rome had never intended to honour its promises. The Goths were not settlers, they were prey. So he began preparing. Quietly, in tents far from Roman patrols, Gothic warriors cleaned swords they weren't supposed to have. They repaired armour piece by piece, trading with corrupt soldiers who couldn't resist easy profit. They organised into units that looked like family groups but functioned like military companies. And they waited for a spark. The spark came in the form of an invitation. Lupicinus, apparently believing his own propaganda about Gothic weakness, decided to host a banquet. He invited Fritigern and Alavivus, another Gothic leader, to dine with him at Marcianople. The official purpose was negotiation, a discussion of settlement terms, food distribution, the various complaints that had accumulated over the winter. The actual purpose was murder. Lupicinus had decided that the Gothic problem could be solved by eliminating its leadership. Without Fritigern and Alavivus, the refugees would fragment, become manageable, submit to whatever terms Rome imposed. It was the kind of plan that seems clever to men who have never met their enemies. The banquet began normally enough. Food was served. Real food. The first the Gothic leaders had seen in months. Wine flowed. Roman officers made polite conversation through translators, asking about Gothic customs, pretending interest in barbarian culture. Outside, Gothic warriors who had accompanied their leaders waited in a courtyard, growing restless as the hours passed. Then the screaming started. What exactly happened inside the banquet hall remains unclear. Lupicinus gave a signal. Roman soldiers drew weapons. Alavivus died. That much is certain. His body left on the dining floor amid overturned tables and spilled wine. Fritigern should have died too, and he didn't. Whether through luck, skill, or the intervention of guards who hadn't received clear orders, Fritigern fought his way out. He burst from the hall into the courtyard where his warriors waited, and he spoke the words that ended any hope of peace. "They've killed Alavivus. They tried to kill me. We are at war." The Gothic War began that night, in a courtyard slick with Roman blood. The news reached Lupicinus while Gothic warriors were still killing his soldiers in the streets of Marcianople. He had miscalculated. Badly. The assassination attempt that was supposed to decapitate the Gothic leadership had instead decapitated his own control of the situation. Alavivus was dead, yes, but Alavivus had been the moderate, the one who counselled patience, the one who believed Rome might still honour its promises. Fritigern, the survivor, harboured no such illusions. And Fritigern was now loose in a province full of armed, starving, furious Goths. The violence spread like fire through dry grass. Gothic families who had suffered months of abuse suddenly found themselves defended by warriors with nothing left to lose. Roman merchants who had grown rich selling dog meat for children were dragged from their homes and beaten to death. Tax collectors, grain speculators, slave traders, anyone associated with the exploitation became targets. But Fritigern understood that rage alone wouldn't save his people. He needed organisation, he needed weapons, and he needed to move before Lupicinus could concentrate his forces. The Goths hit the Roman supply depot at Marcianople first. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. The same wagons that had rolled past starving refugees for months now fed Gothic warriors preparing for war. Grain stores that had been delayed by bureaucratic obstacles were distributed in hours. Weapons stockpiled for Roman legions found their way into Gothic hands. Lupicinus responded the way mediocre generals always respond to situations spiralling beyond their control. He attacked. 9 miles outside Marcianople, he caught up with Fritigern's forces, or thought he did. The Roman commander had perhaps 5,000 men, a mixed force of limitani, border troops, and whatever cavalry he could scrape together. He expected to face disorganized refugees, perhaps armed but certainly not disciplined. What he found was an army. Fritigern had spent the winter doing more than grieving. He had identified the best warriors among the Gothic refugees, organised them into units, developed simple but effective tactics. The Goths couldn't match Roman discipline in a set-piece battle, not yet, but they didn't need to. They needed to survive, and surviving meant fighting on their terms. The battle was brief and decisive. Lupicinus led a cavalry charge that should have broken the Gothic line. Instead, it tangled in terrain Fritigern had chosen specifically because it would neutralise Roman horsemen, broken ground, thick underbrush, a stream that turned to mud under hooves. The Roman cavalry stalled. The Gothic infantry closed in. Historians still debate whether Lupicinus died in the fighting or fled before the rout became complete. What's certain is that his army ceased to exist as a coherent force. The Goths captured Roman standards, Roman armour, Roman horses. They stripped the dead and dressed themselves in the equipment of their oppressors. The province of Thrace now belonged to Fritigern. News of the disaster reached Valens in Antioch, and the emperor faced an impossible choice. He was preparing for a major campaign against Persia, a campaign years in the planning, with forces already assembled, supplies already stockpiled. The eastern frontier demanded attention. Treaties needed to be enforced, but Thrace was burning. Valens made the decision that would define his reign. He sent a subordinate to handle the Gothic problem. The general Trajan, not to be confused with the emperor of the same name, received orders to contain the situation with whatever forces were available, stabilise, delay, buy time until the Persian matter could be resolved. It was a reasonable strategy if the Gothic uprising had been a typical barbarian raid: hit hard, grab plunder, retreat before organised resistance arrived. But Fritigern wasn't raiding. He was fighting for survival. His people had nowhere to go. The Huns blocked any return across the Danube, and the empire surrounded them on every other side. So instead of retreating, the Goths grew. Other barbarian groups, Alans who had fled the Huns, renegade Roman soldiers, escaped slaves, joined Fritigern's force. The Gothic army swelled through 377, absorbing anyone who had reason to hate Rome. They defeated Roman forces at Adsalices, fought to a bloody stalemate that left thousands dead on both sides, but failed to destroy them. Valens received reports of each engagement and grew increasingly alarmed. This was not containment. This was metastasis. By early 378, the emperor abandoned his Persian preparations and marched west with the main Eastern Field Army. Perhaps 30 to 40,000 men, including elite Palatine units, veteran cavalry, the cream of Roman military power. He would solve the Gothic problem personally. His nephew Gratian, Emperor of the West, was already moving to join him with additional forces. Together, they would crush the Goths between two armies, restore order to Thrace, and demonstrate that Rome still commanded the world. Valens agreed to wait for Gratian. He agreed to coordinate. He agreed to patience. He would keep none of those agreements. The road to Adrianople was paved with broken promises, Roman and Gothic alike. Valens arrived in Constantinople on May 30th, 378 AD, and the city that should have welcomed him with triumph greeted him with something closer to contempt. The eastern capital had never loved this emperor. Valens was an Arian Christian, following a theological position that Constantinople's population, increasingly committed to Nicene orthodoxy, considered heresy. When he entered the city, crowds lined the streets not to cheer but to jeer. They threw insults, some threw stones. A man who had ruled for 14 years, who had defended the empire against Persia, who had maintained the eastern frontier through endless crises, was mocked by his own subjects. The humiliation burned. Inside the imperial palace, the burning continued. Reports arrived describing Gothic raids across Thrace, villages sacked, estates plundered, Roman citizens fleeing to walled cities. Each report was an indictment. Each burning farm was a failure of imperial protection. Valens had delayed coming west, prioritized the Persian frontier, trusted subordinates to handle a problem that had now consumed an entire province. His generals counseled patience. Wait for Gratian. The Western Emperor was marching with significant forces, experienced legions that had just won a major victory against the Alemanni on the Rhine frontier. Together, the combined Roman armies would outnumber the Goths substantially. Victory would be certain, but certainty had a price, and that price was glory. Valens was 50 years old. His reign had been competent but unremarkable, the kind of steady governance that keeps empires functioning but doesn't inspire songs or statues. His brother Valentinian, now dead, had been the warrior. His nephew Gratian was proving himself on the Rhine. The Eastern Augustus had spent 14 years administering, negotiating, compromising. Now finally he had a war. His war. A chance to prove that competence and courage were not mutually exclusive. Historians still debate whether personal jealousy drove Valens' decision, or whether a legitimate strategic concerns played a role. The Goths might scatter if given time. They might receive reinforcements. Rumours suggested other barbarian groups were considering joining Fritigern. Delay carried risks of its own. But the sources are clear about one thing. When messengers arrived in early August with news that Gratian was close, perhaps days away, Valens did not rejoice. He worried. The emperor called a council. His generals presented the situation. Gothic forces had concentrated near Adrianople, a major city about 150 miles northwest of Constantinople. Estimates of their strength varied. Scouts reported perhaps 10,000 warriors. Some advisors suggested the number might be higher. Others dismissed the cautious assessments as timidity. The council divided. Sebastian, a talented general recently arrived from the west, argued for immediate action. He had conducted successful raids against Gothic foraging parties and believed the enemy was weaker than they appeared. Wait, he counselled, and the Goths would melt away. Attack now, and glory was certain. Others disagreed. Ricomers, Gratian's representative at the council, carried a message from the Western Emperor. Wait for me. We will share the victory. The cautious voices pointed out that combined forces would number perhaps 60,000 men. Overwhelming superiority. Why risk anything? Valens listened to both sides. Then a new piece of intelligence arrived. Intelligence that would prove catastrophically wrong. Scouts reported the Gothic camp near Adrianople contained approximately 10,000 warriors. The rest of their forces were scattered, foraging, guarding supply lines, watching for Roman movements. If Valens struck quickly, he could destroy the Gothic leadership before they could concentrate. The number 10,000 echoed in the council chamber. 10,000 against perhaps 40,000 Romans. 4-1 odds, better than any general could reasonably expect. Valens made his decision. At dawn on August 9th, 378 AD, the Eastern Roman army marched from its camp outside Adrianople. The emperor rode at its head, gilded armour gleaming in the early light. Behind him stretched the greatest concentration of Roman military power the East had seen in a generation. Legions that traced their lineages back centuries, cavalry units recruited from the finest horsemen of the empire, officers who had spent careers preparing for exactly this moment. 8 miles separated them from the Gothic wagon circle. 8 miles of dust, of August heat, of a sun that would not relent. Gratian was less than a week away. His messengers had confirmed he was coming, that he was hurrying, that the combined victory Valens had once anticipated was still possible. The Emperor marched anyway. What drove him? Pride, certainly. The sting of Constantinople's mockery, the fear that his nephew would claim credit for a victory won by Eastern blood. Perhaps simple impatience, a lifetime of waiting transformed into a single fatal inability to wait 1 week more. The road to the killing ground stretched ahead. The legions marched, and somewhere beyond the horizon, Gothic cavalry was already riding home. The Gothic wagon circle sat on a low rise like a wound on the landscape. From a distance it looked almost peaceful. Hundreds of heavy carts chained together in a rough oval, wheels locked, forming a wooden wall perhaps 15 feet high. Smoke rose from cooking fires within, cattle lowed. The sounds of a camp, a community, drifted across the August air. Roman scouts had observed this position for days. They had counted warriors on the walls. They had noted the absence of cavalry. They had reported what they saw. A defensive position held by perhaps 10,000 Gothic fighters, waiting for a Roman assault they knew they could not win. Everything the scouts reported was accurate, and everything the scouts reported was wrong. Fritigern had prepared for this moment since the failed assassination at Adrianople. He understood Roman military doctrine better than most barbarian leaders, the product of years trading with the Empire, fighting for it, studying how its armies operated. He knew that Romans trusted their intelligence. He knew they made decisions based on what scouts reported, and he knew that scouts could only report what they could see. The Gothic cavalry wasn't in the wagon circle. It wasn't visible. It was miles away, foraging across the Thracian countryside under the command of Alathius and Saphrax, leaders of the Groithungi Goths, another tribe that had joined Fritigern's growing confederation. Thousands of horsemen scattered across the landscape, invisible to Roman reconnaissance. They weren't foraging by accident. They were foraging by design. Fritigern had sent them out knowing the Romans would come. He had calculated distances, travel times, the speed of messages across open country. When the Romans appeared, he would stall. He would negotiate. He would drag out every conversation, demand hostages, propose terms he knew would be rejected, and every minute he bought was a minute his cavalry was riding closer. The Romans reached visual contact with the Gothic position around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The army had been marching since dawn, 8 miles through heat that exceeded 90 degrees, along roads choked with dust without adequate water. The men were exhausted. They were dehydrated. Some were already suffering from heat stroke, dropping out of formation to collapse in whatever shade they could find. Valens should have stopped. He should have rested his army, brought up water, waited for the cool of evening before any assault. But he was operating on intelligence that said 10,000 Goths waited ahead, 10,000 enemies who might flee if given the night to reconsider, 10,000 barbarians who had no business defeating 2 legions, let alone 40,000 men. So he ordered the army to deploy. Historians still debate whether Valens intended to attack immediately or simply to pressure the Goths into negotiation. What's certain is that deploying an army from march column into battle formation takes hours. Units that had been strung out along miles of road had to concentrate. Cavalry had to move to the flanks. Infantry had to form the dense shield walls that had made Roman legions dominant for centuries. While this was happening, while 40,000 exhausted, thirsty men shuffled into position under the hammer of the sun, Fritigern sent messengers. He wanted to talk. The Gothic leader proposed negotiations. He suggested prisoner exchanges. He requested that a high-ranking Roman hostage enter the Gothic camp to guarantee safe conduct. The proposals were reasonable enough that Valens couldn't dismiss them outright, not with his own army still deploying, not with the possibility that bloodshed might yet be avoided. So the Emperor waited. He sent representatives. He received counter-proposals. Hours passed. The sun crept westward. The Roman soldiers stood in formation, armour baking, throats cracking, watching the wagon circle that wasn't attacking, wasn't surrendering, wasn't doing anything except existing. Inside that circle, Fritigern watched the horizon, and then, distant at first but growing, the sound of hooves. Alathius and Saphrax had received the message. The Gothic cavalry was coming. They had ridden hard across the Thracian plains, pushing their horses to the limit, racing toward a battle they could not afford to miss. They arrived at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They arrived on the Roman flanks. They arrived with numbers that made the morning's intelligence reports look like cruel jokes. Not 10,000 Goths, but perhaps 35 to 40,000 warriors combined. The Roman 4-1 advantage vanished in the thunder of approaching cavalry. The careful calculations that had justified the march evaporated in an instant. Fritigern had never been weak. He had been waiting. The trap was sprung. Before we see what happens next, understand one thing. The men who died at Adrianople were already dying before the first blade fell. 8 miles of march, August heat, no water, 60 pounds of armour, weapons and equipment. The Roman soldier who reached the Gothic wagon circle wasn't a warrior. He was a victim of logistics dressed in bronze and leather, waiting for permission to collapse. The morning had begun with confidence. Camp Reveille sounded in darkness, allowing the army to march during the coolest hours. But coolest was relative. Thracian August offers no mercy, only degrees of punishment. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, men were already sweating through their tunics. By mid-morning, water skins were empty. The road itself became an enemy. Drought had baked the surface to powder, and 40,000 pairs of feet churned that powder into a choking cloud that rose 50 feet high and turned the marching column into a line of ghosts. Men wrapped cloths across their faces. It didn't help. The dust found every opening, eyes, noses, throats, coating everything with grit that turned to mud when it mixed with sweat. Cavalry scouts ranged ahead, reporting the Gothic position, the wagon circle, the absence of significant forces outside the defensive perimeter. The reports were encouraging. Valens pressed the pace. Every hour of delay was an hour the Goths might use to escape, to scatter, to deny him the decisive battle he craved. The sun pressed down like a fist. Heat casualties began around noon. Soldiers who had survived frontier campaigns, who had fought Persians and Germans and everything in between, simply stopped walking and sat down. Some were carried by comrades, some were left behind. The column stretched, gaps appearing between units as the strong pulled ahead and the weak fell back. Water became the only thing anyone could think about. Men fantasized about streams, about rain, about the aqueducts of Constantinople they had passed through just days before. Officers promised water ahead. At the Gothic position, surely there would be streams, supplies, something. The promises kept feet moving. Then the smoke appeared. Fritigern had ordered the fields burned. Not for tactical advantage, the grass was too dry and the wind too unpredictable for controlled fire, but for psychological impact. The Romans would march through smoke, breathe smoke, feel their eyes streaming and their lungs burning before they ever reached the battle. It worked. The army that emerged from the smokescreen around early afternoon bore little resemblance to the force that had left camp that morning. Men were staggering. Units had lost cohesion. The precise Roman formations, the neat rectangles that had dominated battlefields for centuries, looked more like crowds than armies. Valens called for deployment anyway. The process took hours. Infantry units had to find their assigned positions, dress their ranks, lock their shields into the overlapping formation that made a Roman line nearly impenetrable. Cavalry had to move to the flanks, the left wing under richer mayors, who had argued against this very battle, and various commanders on the right. The Gothic wagon circle sat half a mile away, silent except for the lowing of cattle and the distant sounds of women and children. Smoke rose from cooking fires as if this were an ordinary day, as if 40,000 armed men weren't deploying for slaughter. Historians still debate whether the Goths inside the circle were genuinely preparing food or simply maintaining the illusion of normality. What's certain is that the smell of roasting meat drifted across the battlefield, the first food the Roman soldiers had been able to smell since dawn, and still the negotiations dragged on. Fritigern sent another embassy, another proposal, another carefully calibrated delay. The sun moved westward. The Roman soldiers stood in formation, forbidden to sit, forbidden to seek shade, watching nothing happen. Some units gave up waiting. On the Roman left, whether through miscommunication or simple impatience, cavalry began moving toward the wagon circle without orders. A few Gothic arrows answered. The cavalry pulled back. The moment passed, but discipline was fraying. The heat, the thirst, the endless standing, The enemy that wouldn't fight, it was all too much. When the Gothic cavalry finally appeared, some small part of the Roman army must have felt relief. At least now they would die of something other than thirst. The thunder of hooves grew louder, the dust clouds on the horizon thickened, and on the Roman flanks officers began screaming orders that no one could hear over the sound of their own doom approaching. This was the end of the beginning, and here's where it gets worse. The Gothic cavalry hit the Roman left flank at full gallop, and the sound was unlike anything the legions had ever heard. Not the clash of infantry, that familiar grinding crash of shield against shield, iron against iron. This was different. This was thunder made flesh. Thousands of hooves striking packed earth in near unison, a rolling wall of noise that overwhelmed shouted orders, drowned out trumpets, made communication impossible. Then came the impact. The Roman left wing consisted of cavalry units that should have been able to meet such a charge. On any other day they might have, but these horsemen had marched 8 miles through furnace heat. Their mounts were exhausted, barely watered, standing in formation for hours while negotiations dragged on. When the Gothic cavalry crashed into them, they didn't fight, they disintegrated. Horses went down screaming, riders were thrown, trampled, speared while struggling to rise. The neat Roman cavalry formation, meant to screen the infantry flank, collapsed inward, survivors fleeing not away from the battle but toward the infantry they were supposed to protect. And behind the Gothic cavalry came more Goths. Infantry from the wagon circle, seeing their horsemen successful, surged forward. The wagons that had seemed like a defensive position revealed their true purpose, a staging area, a base of operations from which the Gothic army could deploy once the moment was right. The moment was now. Valens was somewhere in the Roman centre when the flank collapsed. The dust, the noise, the chaos of thousands of panicking cavalrymen streaming past made accurate intelligence impossible. Messengers couldn't get through, officers couldn't see. The carefully planned Roman deployment became irrelevant in an instant. The left wing ceased to exist as a fighting force within 15 minutes. What happened next defied Roman military experience. The Goths didn't pursue the fleeing cavalry. They wheeled inward, toward the Roman infantry centre. Horsemen who should have been riding down scattered fugitives instead crashed into the legions from the flank, an angle Roman infantry doctrine never anticipated. The legions tried to form a defensive square. It was the correct response. Infantry under cavalry attack should contract, present shields in all directions, become an armoured hedgehog that horsemen cannot penetrate. Roman soldiers had drilled this manoeuvre for centuries, but the drill assumed space, it assumed time, it assumed that units could move without obstruction. None of those assumptions held. The Roman army was packed too closely. Units that tried to reposition found other units in the way. The dust was so thick that officers couldn't see the men they were commanding. Some units pivoted correctly. Others, receiving no orders, held their original position. Still others broke entirely, soldiers throwing down shields and running. Historians still debate whether any Roman unit maintained combat effectiveness beyond the first half hour. The sources describe chaos so complete that the concept of unit became meaningless. The army was no longer an organisation, it was a crowd, and crowds have no tactics. The Goths pressed inward from both flanks now. The cavalry had swept around the entire Roman position, linking up behind the legions and cutting off retreat. The infantry from the wagons pushed forward, driving into a Roman mass that could no longer manoeuvre, could no longer form proper battle lines, could barely raise weapons. Men died standing up because there was no room to fall. The compression became the killer. Roman soldiers, pressed from all sides, found themselves immobilised by their own comrades. Shields that were meant to protect became obstacles. Men couldn't lower them, couldn't raise their swords, couldn't do anything except stand and wait for a Gothic blade to find the gap. The screaming stopped making sense. It became a wall of sound, inhuman, like wind through a slaughterhouse. The ground, already dusty, turned to mud, but the liquid wasn't water. Blood mixed with churned earth, and men who fell found themselves drowning in it, pinned beneath the weight of the dying. Valens tried to restore order. He must have. Emperors don't simply give up. But what could orders accomplish when no one could hear them? What could leadership achieve when the Eled had become an undifferentiated mass of flesh being systematically dismembered? The afternoon light began to fade. The killing did not. Gothic warriors worked through the Roman mass with methodical patience, stabbing into the crush, stepping over bodies, stabbing again. They had no need for tactics. They simply needed to keep pressing, keep killing, keep harvesting men who couldn't run and couldn't fight back. Somewhere in that mass, the Emperor of Rome was dying. The killing lasted until darkness made it impossible, and by then, there was almost no one left to kill. Ancient sources struggle to describe what happened in the final hours of Adrianople. Ammianus Marcellinus, the last great Roman historian, served in the Eastern Army and may have known survivors. His account speaks of men packed together so tightly that they could not draw their swords, and bodies heaped up like waves in a sea. The language fails because language was never meant for this. The compression reached its peak around sunset. 40,000 Roman soldiers, those who hadn't fled in the first chaos, were pressed into a space perhaps a quarter mile across. The Gothic infantry formed a ring around them, pressing inward. The Gothic cavalry circled the perimeter, riding down anyone who broke free. Inside that ring, men died from suffocation before Gothic swords could reach them. The weight of bodies against bodies, armour against armour, created pressure that collapsed lungs and stopped hearts. Soldiers who had survived decades of frontier warfare found themselves unable to breathe, unable to move, watching the darkening sky through the forest of helmets above them. The ground became uncertain. So many bodies had fallen that the living stood on corpses, their footing shifting with each movement, ankle deep in the remains of their comrades. When a man fell, he didn't reach the earth, he sank into a layer of the dead, and more bodies fell on top of him. The sound changed as the hours passed. The screaming faded. Men had no breath left for screaming. What remained was something lower, quieter, groaning, whimpering, the wet sounds of blades finding flesh, and beneath everything, the crunch of bone breaking under accumulated weight. Historians still debate whether Roman discipline held at all during the final phase, or whether the army simply ceased to exist as a military organisation. Some accounts suggest that small groups formed defensive clusters, fighting back to back until overrun. Others describe complete disintegration, individuals struggling to survive with no thought for formation or tactics. What's certain is that the empire's finest soldiers, men who had defeated Persians, who had suppressed revolts, who had maintained Rome's frontiers for generations, died helpless, many without swinging a sword. Among them, somewhere, was their emperor. Valens' death remains one of history's great mysteries. No one saw him fall, no one recovered his body. The confusion was so complete that an emperor of Rome, wearing gilded armour surrounded by imperial guards, simply vanished into the mass grave his army had become. One account says he was wounded by an arrow and carried to a nearby farmhouse, where Gothic warriors found him. Not recognising the emperor, they set fire to the building, burning Valens alive with his attendants. Another account says he fell in the fighting, his body stripped and lost among thousands of other corpses. Either way, the result was the same. Rome had no body to mourn, no grave to mark, no death to avenge. The darkness brought mercy of a sort. The Goths couldn't see to kill efficiently, and the survivors who had reached the edges of the massacre used the night to escape. How many? Perhaps a third of the army, perhaps less. They fled in all directions, toward Adrianople's walls, toward Constantinople, toward anywhere that wasn't the killing ground. Behind them, they left perhaps 20,000 dead. Dawn on August 10th revealed a landscape that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. The battlefield had become a topography of corpses, hills and valleys of human remains stretching across the plain. The Gothic camp stirred with activity as warriors moved among the dead, stripping armour, collecting weapons, finishing the few Romans still breathing. The smell began almost immediately. August heat and tens of thousands of bodies created a stench that would linger for months. Birds gathered. Dogs from nearby settlements ventured in, then fled from the scale of the feast. Fritigern surveyed his victory and understood immediately that it was incomplete. He had destroyed an army, but the walls of Adrianople still stood, and behind those walls waited an empire that would send another army, and another, and another. The Goths tried to storm Adrianople the next day. They failed. They tried again. Failed again. The walls that couldn't save the army could save a city, and the Goths had neither the equipment nor the expertise for siege warfare. The battle was over. The real tragedy was just beginning. Rome had lost an emperor, an army, and something more precious than either, the belief that it could not be beaten. The empire learned of Adrianople the way empires always learn of disasters. slowly, in fragments, through rumours that grew worse with each retelling. Constantinople heard first, refugees streaming through the gates, wounded soldiers who had somehow survived the march home, officers who had escaped the killing ground and lived long enough to deliver reports no one wanted to hear. The emperor was dead. The army was destroyed. The Goths were coming. Panic spread faster than the news itself. Citizens who had mocked Valens weeks before now feared his absence. The streets filled with people demanding answers no one could provide. How many dead? Tens of thousands. Where was the enemy? Coming. What would stop them? Nothing. The city's garrison consisted of a handful of units, barely enough to man the walls. If the Goths arrived in force, Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Eastern Empire, Constantine's great creation, the bridge between Europe and Asia, would fall. But the Goths didn't arrive. Fritigern had learned something from his failed assaults on Adrianople's walls. Gothic warriors could slaughter Roman soldiers in open battle, but they could not take cities. The great walled centres of the empire, Constantinople, Thessalonica, Adrianople itself, remained beyond his reach. His cavalry, so devastating on the battlefield, was useless against 30-foot stone fortifications. So the Goths did what they could. They raided. The countryside of Thrace, already devastated by 2 years of war, suffered final destruction. Villages that had survived the initial uprising were now systematically stripped. Estate owners who had hidden in their villas were dragged out and killed. The agricultural infrastructure that fed the cities was dismantled, burned, rendered useless. The survivors fled to anywhere with walls. The roads to Constantinople filled with refugees, Roman citizens this time, experiencing what the Goths had experienced 2 years before. They arrived hungry, terrified, carrying children who didn't understand why home no longer existed. Historians still debate whether Fritigern could have taken Constantinople if he had marched immediately after Adrianople. The city's defences were weak, its garrison minimal, its population demoralised. But the Gothic leader hesitated, first to loot the battlefield, then to attempt the walls of Adrianople, then to consolidate his position. The hesitation saved the empire. In the west, Gratian received news of his uncle's death and faced an impossible situation. The army he had been leading east, the reinforcements Valens hadn't waited for, was still intact. But what could he do with it? Attack the Goths with forces that might suffer the same fate as Adrianople? Abandon the western frontier to enemies who would exploit any weakness? Gratian chose a different path. He sent for help. Theodosius was a Spanish general of considerable reputation, son of a renowned military commander, forced into retirement by political enemies years before. Gratian elevated him to Augustus, co-emperor of the East, and gave him an impossible task: save what remained of Roman power in the Balkans with no army and no money. Theodosius arrived in Constantinople in early 379 to find an empire in ruins. The Eastern Field Army had been destroyed. The treasury was empty. Valens had spent heavily on his failed campaign. The cities were overflowing with refugees. The countryside was controlled by Goths. What he did next would determine whether Rome survived or fell. The new emperor began rebuilding immediately, but the process was agonizingly slow. Recruiting an army required money Rome didn't have. Training that army required time Rome might not have. And the Goths weren't waiting. They continued to raid, to burn, to remind everyone that Adrianople had changed everything. Theodosius tried diplomacy first. He sent embassies to Fritigern, exploring whether peace was possible. The negotiations went nowhere. Both sides remembered too much. The Goths remembered dog meat and stolen children. The Romans remembered 20,000 corpses. Trust was impossible. Meanwhile, the mystery of Valens deepened. Search parties combed the Adrianople battlefield, looking for imperial remains. They found nothing recognizable. The armor that should have identified the emperor had been stripped. The body that should have been unmistakable had been mutilated beyond recognition, or destroyed in the farmhouse fire. Rome couldn't bury its dead emperor. It couldn't even prove he was dead. In the official histories, Valens died heroically, fighting to the last. In the whispered stories that spread through the empire, he died screaming in flames, or crawling in mud, or simply vanishing, swallowed by a disaster so complete it couldn't be processed. The truth was simpler and more terrible. An emperor had ceased to matter. His death meant less than the deaths of the 20,000 men who fell with him. The empire would survive or fall based on what came next, not on what had been lost. Valens became a lesson, not a legend. Theodosius solved the Gothic problem by accepting Gothic victory. It took 3 years of grinding warfare to reach that conclusion. 3 years of raids and counter-raids, of cities besieged and relieved, of diplomacy attempted and collapsed. The new Eastern Emperor tried everything military logic suggested, recruiting Gothic deserters into Roman units, hiring other barbarian groups to fight the Goths, building fortifications, conducting punitive expeditions. None of it worked. The fundamental problem was arithmetic. Adrianople had destroyed the Eastern Field Army, and replacing those soldiers required a generation. Rome could recruit, could train, could equip, but it could not make veterans overnight. The legions Theodosius assembled were shadows of the force Valens had led to slaughter. They won skirmishes, they lost battles, they survived without dominating. Fritigern, meanwhile, held his coalition together through success. The Goths, Alans, and other barbarian groups who had joined his confederation after Adrianople remained loyal because rebellion paid. Roman plunder funded Gothic warriors. Roman land sustained Gothic families. The system that had created the uprising continued to feed it. The breakthrough came in 382, and it came not through strength, but through exhaustion. Both sides were tired. The Goths controlled the countryside, but they couldn't take cities, and without cities, they couldn't establish permanent control. The Romans held the cities, but they couldn't pacify the countryside, and without agricultural production, the cities were slowly starving. The war had reached stalemate, and stalemate meant mutual destruction. Theodosius offered terms that would have been unthinkable before Adrianople. The Goths would receive land, not as scattered refugees to be exploited, but as a unified people maintaining their own laws and leadership. They would settle in Thrace, the very province they had devastated. They would serve in the Roman army, but under their own commanders, as allied forces rather than absorbed conscripts. Historians still debate whether Theodosius's settlement was wise pragmatism or catastrophic surrender. It established a precedent that barbarian groups could negotiate with Rome as equals, could demand and receive concessions that earlier emperors would have died before granting. It created an armed foreign nation within the empire's borders, loyal to their own chiefs first and the emperor second. But it also ended the war. Fritigern apparently accepted the terms, though the sources become confused about his fate in the years following Adrianople. Some accounts suggest he died around 380, perhaps of illness, leaving his people to negotiate without him. Others claim he lived to see the settlement. Either way, the man who had destroyed a Roman army at Adrianople did not live to enjoy the peace. The settlement meant that everything Valens had died for was surrendered at a negotiating table. The emperor had marched to destroy the Goths, to punish them for their uprising, to restore Roman authority in Thrace. Instead, his successor gave them exactly what they had demanded before the first sword was drawn: land, autonomy, dignity. The dog meat and the stolen children remained unavenged. The Roman merchants and soldiers who had created the uprising through their cruelty faced no consequences. The empire learned nothing from the human cost of its frontier policies, nothing at least that it chose to remember. What Rome did learn was military. The Gothic cavalry that had destroyed the legions at Adrianople represented a style of warfare the Romans had underestimated for centuries. Heavy horsemen, equipped with lances and armour, operating in coordinated formations. This was the future of European warfare, and Adrianople announced that future in blood. The empire adapted. Future Roman armies would emphasise cavalry over infantry, mobility over the heavy formations that had conquered the Mediterranean world. The legion, that fundamental unit of Roman military power since the days of the Republic, began its long decline into irrelevance. Theodosius himself became something history had rarely seen, an emperor who built success on failure. He couldn't undo Adrianople, he couldn't recover the dead, he couldn't pretend that the empire remained what it had been. But he could work with what remained, could patch together a functioning state from damaged pieces, could prove that Rome could survive even the loss of invincibility. It was enough. It had to be enough. The Goths who settled in Thrace after 382 would remain there for decades, sometimes loyal to the empire that had wronged them, sometimes not. Their descendants would sack Rome itself in 410, another lesson in the long consequences of Adrianople. But that tragedy belonged to the future. For now, The immediate crisis had passed. The empire had survived. The price was everything it had once believed about itself. Rome endured. Its certainties did not. The battlefield at Adrianople was never properly cleared. For years after the slaughter, travellers on the road reported the same thing. Bones. Not neat graves, not monuments, not any of the rituals that Romans performed for their honoured dead. Just bones, bleaching in the Thracian sun, scattered across fields that farmers no longer cultivated, picked clean by scavengers and left where they lay. 20,000 men, no tombs, no inscriptions, no names. The empire that had built monuments to victories couldn't manage a cemetery for its greatest defeat. The survivors were too few, the territory too dangerous, the resources too depleted. And so the legions who had marched out in gilded armour became white fragments in brown grass, indistinguishable from each other, from their enemies, from the animals that had died alongside them. History remembers commanders. It forgets the commanded. Valens' missing body became a symbol of the defeat's completeness. Other emperors had died in battle, but their bodies had been recovered, mourned, buried with appropriate ceremony. Valens simply disappeared. The farmhouse story, if true, meant his remains were ash scattered by wind. The battlefield story meant his corpse lay among thousands of others, stripped of identifying marks, anonymous in death as he had hoped to be glorious in victory. The empire tried to forget. It couldn't. Every military decision for the next century was made in Adrianople's shadow. Commanders who might have risked battle chose caution, remembering what overconfidence had cost. Emperors who might have crushed barbarian threats instead negotiated, remembering that overwhelming force had meant nothing against Gothic cavalry. The institutional memory of the Roman army became a memory of trauma. Theodosius spent the remainder of his reign managing the consequences of a battle he hadn't fought. He incorporated Gothic warriors into Roman forces. The same warriors who had butchered legionaries at Adrianople now wore Roman uniforms and drew Roman pay. It was necessary. It was pragmatic. It was also a constant reminder that Rome had lost the ability to defeat its enemies and now survived by hiring them. Historians still debate whether Adrianople caused Rome's fall or merely accelerated processes already underway. The empire had been weakening for decades. Civil wars, economic crises, the endless pressure on multiple frontiers. Adrianople didn't create these problems, but it demonstrated in a single August afternoon that the empire's military dominance was no longer assured. The barbarians noticed. Every tribe on every frontier learned the lesson of Adrianople. The legions could be beaten. Not just raided, not just evaded, not just survived, actually destroyed. The aura of Roman invincibility, cultivated through centuries of conquest, shattered in the Thracian dust, and once that aura was gone, it could never be restored. 32 years after Adrianople, Alaric the Goth, leading descendants of the very warriors who had fought under Fritigern, sacked Rome itself. The Eternal City, unviolated for 800 years, fell to barbarians who had learned their grandfathers' lessons well. The soldiers who looted Roman temples and palaces were, legally, Roman allies. The empire had invited its destroyers inside and called it peace. The pattern repeated across the next century. Vandals, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Huns, one after another, barbarian groups extracted concessions from an empire that could no longer refuse them. Each settlement echoed the Gothic settlement of 382. Each humiliation traced its lineage to the field where Valens had died. The Western Empire collapsed in 476, 98 years after Adrianople. The Eastern Empire survived another millennium, but it survived as something different. A Greek Christian kingdom centred on Constantinople, not a Latin military power centred on Rome. The legions that had made Rome mistress of the Mediterranean world were gone, replaced by cavalry forces that owed more to Gothic precedent than Roman tradition. In the end, the empire adapted. That was what empires did. They absorbed defeats, learned lessons, transformed into whatever form survival required. Rome didn't die at Adrianople, it changed. But the men who died on that August afternoon experienced no transformation. For them, there was only the dust and the heat, the thunder of hooves and the compression of bodies, the slow realization that everything they had trained for, everything they had believed about Roman superiority, was failing them completely. They died in armour that couldn't protect them, serving an emperor who couldn't lead them, fighting for an empire that would forget their names. Valens died somewhere among them, a 50-year-old man who had ruled for 14 years, who had made decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, who had wanted glory and found annihilation. His body was never recovered. His legacy became a cautionary tale. The victory he had sought became his nephew's task, and his successor's burden, and eventually, after enough treaties and compromises and surrenders, something no one remembered fighting for at all. The Goths who killed him became Roman allies. The empire he served endured another century. The battle that consumed his army became a paragraph in textbooks, then a footnote, then a date memorized and forgotten by students who couldn't locate Thrace on a map. The empire endured, the man did not. History remembers the defeat. It forgot the defeated. The 20,000 who marched 8 miles through August heat, who stood in formation while their emperor negotiated, who died crushed together so tightly they couldn't raise their swords. They built no statues, they dug no graves. They left only bones in the Thracian sun, and a lesson the world would never quite forget. Even Rome could fall.